Welcome to my podcast on this beautiful summer's day. I'm sitting in a little sitting room at the back of the castle, looking straight up the hill at a folly which was built in 1737. But it's called Heaven's Gate, and it sort of reaches your eye through the arch, and I imagine towards the clouds and the heaven. But more importantly, I'm sitting in this pretty sitting room with a very special and dear friend and renowned author, Shrabani Basu.
Lovely to be here, Fiona. It's just great to be here, and the summer day.
Shrabani, thank you so much for coming here today. I think, was it a summer's day that we first met at Henley Literary Festival? I remember it really clearly. I think we were both in the green room at the back and it was time for a bit to eat. And I saw this lovely lady sitting to one side. So I asked if you minded if I sat down with you. And we just fell to talking.
That's right.
And you were soon coming round.
That's right. It was just after Victoria and Abdul was published. And it was, I think it was autumn, the Henley Lit Fest. And I think we were both hungry before our talks.
Yes.
And it was, And since then I have come so many times. You've been really kind inviting me to this beautiful place, steeped in history.
My God, it's been such a joy, Shrabani. And I remember, because I was so blown away to meet the author of Victoria Abdul, which those who are listening might have seen the film as well as, I hope, read the book. And the film starred Judi Dench, and I loved the film. I was blown away by it. She was an extraordinary woman, Queen Victoria, and I so enjoyed it. It was beautifully filmed, Osborne House, oh my goodness. Did you have fun when it was being filmed, or was that a challenge for you as the author?
Oh, I loved it. It was precious moments spent on set. I mean, what a treat. You know, my first book to be adapted into a film, and it's made on this scale with Judi Dench and Stephen Frears as the director. It was an A-team. It was just wonderful. And she's such a professional actress. You know, she just gives everything. And it's just fabulous to see her. She is truly inspirational. And
I thought the way it was presented was so interesting, and I know we're all conscious of different people from different cultures, colours and classes today, but do you know, I thought Queen Victoria led the way when I watched that, and to try to learn the language. Exactly. Oh my goodness, and she took it seriously.
Absolutely. So there was, you know, when I first started researching, I went to Windsor Castle and the archives, and I asked to see these Hindustani journals because I knew she'd learnt a little bit of Urdu or Hindustani. And I was expecting a little phrase book, but the archivist walked in with a trolley, and there were 13 volumes there. And she took it so seriously. There's an entry every day, whether she's on holiday in Nice, whether she's on the ship, whether... You know, there's a story that once Abdul was ill, but she was going to have her lesson. So she went to his cottage, propped him up on his pillow, mopped his brow, and had her Hindustani lesson. So, yeah, she really took it seriously. And by the end, she was writing half a page of Urdu, which is amazing.
Quite extraordinary. What an extraordinary lady. And so that's where our friendship began, and... I obviously loved that book, so if people haven't read it yet, please pick it up. There are different elements to it, to any film, but I think the film captured the essence, which is quite unusual, I think, and harder to do. And then I know that after that, I inveigled your help when we were trying to commemorate the end of World War I. And I asked you to come and give a talk here. We were raising money for many different charities from different countries. And you were talking about the million men who fought for king and another country, which was intensely moving. Would you like to talk a little bit to that book?
It was. I mean, it was a real privilege to come here and talk to a very different crowd and tell them. Many people were not aware that 1.5 million soldiers from India came down here, fought in the trenches, you know, in the mud and the cold, in the First World War. So there were turbans, men wearing turbans in these trenches that nobody knew about. And they went on to win Victoria Crosses, made huge sacrifices, of course. And it's just, it's just a moving, fascinating story. And people came up to me after the talk, Fiona, and they said, there was a lady with tears in her eyes. And I said, God, that's not what I intended. But she was so moved. And it was really, really very special to do that.
It was so special. And I'd also was lucky enough to meet the Indian High Commissioner. And he and his team had brought this amazing double-decker bus down in which it could tell part of the story. He was so charming, and he also gave a talk, and again people hadn't known that side of it, and that was extraordinary as well.
It really was. So thank you for doing that.
No, and actually I remember the American ambassador of the time came up to me afterwards and said, because he'd listened to the talks, and he said, thank you. I didn't know that story. I didn't know that part of the military story. And he'd also, I think we all cried, actually. And we probably needed a glass of something afterwards. But no, it was a fantastic day, and I can't thank you enough for your contribution to it. And again, I was trying to turn something to raise money for today, because it's today that we need the money, and cash is needed to support those who've been through experiences that we hope we won't go through. But that was that. And then what was the book after your First World War book?
After that, it was The Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer.
Oh, it's the mystery. That is the
which is my latest book. Yeah, it takes a while. So that was published in 2015. And then because of my books are non-fiction, it takes me years to research. And, there was so much happening. I also work as a journalist, so it was the time of, much political upheaval, many prime ministers coming and going. So, there were pauses. But yes, that was the book. And it's about Arthur Conan Doyle, a true story.
Well, it is a true story. So can I ask, how did you come across the nugget of this particular book?
So Arthur Conan Doyle himself writes about it. He writes about it in his own memoirs. And he says he was really pleased to do this, take up this cause. So I'll just explain what the cause was. This is the only case that Arthur Conan Doyle investigates personally. So he wears the hat of Sherlock Holmes and he takes on a case. And the case is to do with a young Indian lawyer, of Indian origin. He's from Birmingham. And he's been accused of a heinous crime of slashing animals. It's really gory. And he was imprisoned. And then he wrote to Arthur Conan Doyle and said, help me clear my name. And Conan Doyle rises to the occasion and takes up this challenge. And so the book is all about how he, what happened, the backstory, and then how he investigates. It's a bit of a thriller, and you go through how he investigates this case, and it's good fun.
It is good fun, and I found the backstory absolutely fascinating as well. And I hadn't realised how the Parsis were then coming to this country and became a vicar. Do you want to relate that part of the story? Yeah,
so he was a Parsi. Parsis are Zoroastrians from India, and his father was brought up in Bombay, converted from Zoroastrianism to Christianity, and then travelled to England and became a vicar. He was the first South Asian vicar of a small mining town in Staffordshire.
That's what was so extraordinary too.
It was.
Quite a challenging place to be put.
Yeah.
And his wife was English.
His wife was English.
So it was, again, a really interesting story about the prejudices of the time.
Exactly.
And I think as the reader, hoping always for those glimmers of hope and kindness and compassion. And perhaps it's the same today. You don't always find them. And then following the story of the three children through their lives, actually, and their desire to give themselves professional training and be included. It's that thing about being included, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you do, as you said, you do look for hope. So even though he was imprisoned and there was all this the anonymous letters accusing him of doing this, which is why the police just needed someone. They needed to arrest someone. They couldn't find the culprit.
Well,
so they arrested him.
When I was reading, I was thinking of all the bad stories you have on Twitter today. I'm thinking nothing is new. No. And that's exactly what was going on at the same time.
Exactly.
I was just, I had my left and my right hand. I was thinking how plus ça change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the institutional racism, even today in the police, it's now more like unconscious bias rather than, maybe the terms have changed, but it is still there. There's no getting away from it. And, as recently as the COVID lockdowns, we saw who were the people who were locked down first, who were the people who were arrested first. It was always Black and Asian. So, there was a pattern. There was a pattern then, there's a pattern now. But there is hope. I mean, he had Arthur Conan Doyle, so that's the fun bit of the story. No less than ACD comes to, back him. And then the narrative changes because suddenly he's got stardust, Sherlock Holmes is solving this case. And the papers change their tune overnight. And, well, I won't give away the ending.
No, and I'm trying not to either.
But it is really, I mean, he's obsessed with the case, Arthur Conan Doyle. So it's, it's quite amazing to read those letters and see his obsession with the case and how determined he was to get, justice done.
And what's extraordinary is how he decided to pick the case up, those turning points, which were perhaps a smaller thing in Arthur Conan Doyle's life, but changed the life of the imprisoned young man who otherwise nobody else would have fought for him.
No.
So I sometimes find the fragility of those coincidental, extraordinary decisions quite frightening.
It is. And, what can we say? I mean, good for him that he sat there and he thought that there's only one person who can save me, and it's Arthur Conan Doyle. Because in prison, he'd been reading the Sherlock Holmes books, and he had just read The Hound of the Baskerville, which had just been released. So he said, there's one man who can solve it, it's him. And he wrote to him.
I still find that extraordinary stroke of luck that when Arthur Conan Doyle, for some reason, picked up the letter and replied. And I've so often wondered, and I still wonder, why did he take that leap of faith? Why did he apply to that letter? Why that case?
It's really interesting because it's almost like what happens in his books. So at the time this letter drops through his post, it's a time when Arthur Conan Doyle was going through a very low phase in his life. His wife had died, his wife of several years, had died a few months ago. And while he was nursing her, he'd fallen in love with Jean Leckie. So he was tortured by this feeling of guilt that he's now free to marry Jean, and he's mourning for his wife and all these feelings. And it's like the opening of any Sherlock Holmes book where, Sherlock Holmes is a little depressed and not injecting himself with some cocaine. I mean, Conan Doyle wasn't doing that, but he was at a low phase in his life. And suddenly this comes, and this excites him. This is something new. The fact that this is a Parsi obviously had its, and there's miscarriage of justice, which he wants to fight. And he wants to take this case up. He in fact compares it to the case of Emile, what Emile Zola does in France when he fights for Alfred Dreyfus and the Dreyfus affair. He says that happened to a Jew and this is happening to a Parsi. And he takes it up. He wants to be the Emile Zola j'accuse and accuse the Home Office of prejudice, of racism, of incompetence. And he is lauded by his fellow writers who say, well done, because he was championing this cause, a miscarriage of justice. So it all fit in really well. It came at a time when he wanted to do this. And then he gets married, Fiona. He marries Jean. And the only thing he's doing on his honeymoon is writing about this case, writing letters to Anson. So, the Hotel Danieli in Venice and someplace in Germany. But goodness, poor Jean, because all her husband is doing is obsessing about this case.
Yeah.
And he has details. He investigates it. He goes to the US. Correspondence with the US. He's finding clues, interviewing people, doing everything the police should have done. So it's a full-on, proper Sherlock Holmes-style investigation. And in fact, the first time he meets George Idalji, it's a great scene. It's almost like what he does with Sherlock Holmes, which is power of deduction. So the minute Holmes meets somebody and has a case, he's deducting things without even saying a word. Arthur Conan Doyle does the same. He invites George Adalji to meet him at the Grand Hotel in Charing Cross, and he's a little late, so he steps into the lobby and George is waiting for him. And of course, he recognizes him immediately. He's the only Indian in the room, the only dark-skinned person. And he's reading a newspaper, and he's holding the newspaper really close to his face. And immediately he stands there, watches him, and he says, I knew he was innocent, because he says he was myopic, severely myopic, and there was no way he could have crossed those fields in the dark and slashed animals. So here we are, Sherlock Holmes's deductions done without even saying a word to George Adalji. And that's their first meeting.
It really is amazing, that melding of fiction and reality. I mean, of course, we're in Downton Abbey, or Highclere Castle, and in reality, I've just finished a book about the Fifth Earl, and of course it was Arthur Conan Doyle who then started the rumours of the curse of Tutankhamun.
Exactly.
And it was entirely his pen and his fictional belief that then came out, without which we might not have had the curse of Tutankhamun.
Yep, and because by then, this stage in his life, Arthur Conan Doyle was heavily into spiritualism and seances and, talking to the dead, because he'd lost family in the First World War, and that hit him really badly. So he'd made a little shrine on his mantelpiece. His son, his brother, his wife's brother. So, and then he just felt the dead communicate with us. And then this whole curse picked up. And, if it's being sort of said by Arthur Conan Doyle, people believe it. And that's it. So there it was.
But it's interesting, because after the First World War, there was quite a lot of spiritualism and belief in seances, and the Fifth Earl of Carnarvon, I think, probably held a seance here as well. So it was quite popular and fashionable. And Arthur Balfour, who had been Prime Minister, was also, I think he might have been president of the Spiritualist Society in Belgrave Square or something. So it was very much a la mode, which seems quite different now. But coming back to the story of Victoria Abdul, when I was writing the story of the Fifth Earl of Carnarvon, his best friend, his best man, was in India, Prince Victor Julep Singh. And Prince Victor Julep Singh spent so much time here. He gave the grandmother of Geordie the sapphire engagement ring, which was because he was the godfather of the Sixth Earl of Carnarvon.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Didn't you?
That's
He and
amazing.
his Prince Victor Julep Singh and his became a great friend of the Fifth Earl, my character at Eton.
All right.
And they met there in their first year. He joined a little bit late. His father at that time was very much within the very close circle of Queen Victoria.
Of course, yeah.
Reading all about that and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which I've written up in quite a big way, so I hope I can give you the book.
Oh, lovely.
Just again made me look back in awe at Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
She gave him, Prince Victor's father, precedence over all other dukes. She didn't see colour. She was an extraordinary lady in that way.
She really was.
She really was. It was amazing. Anyway, Prince Victor had a marvellous voice and sang very well. Neither he nor the Fifth Earl were particularly academic students, and they were always trying to bunk off. And in his first summer term, Prince Victor put £5 on a horse in the Derby.
Oh.
It was the biggest bet of any boy ever at Eton.
Gosh.
So he claimed great notoriety. And he...
Did he win?
I'm not sure. Probably not is the answer, knowing his luck. And he and his best friend, the Fifth Earl, were always bunking off school, usually on Windsor Racecourse, or they were staying with the Fifth Earl's grandmother in London or at Chesterfield. So they became the best of friends. And Prince Victor gave the Fifth Earl a present of a snake to take back to school, which used to live in his desk at Eton, amongst other things. And one returned to school, they couldn't find it. They found it up a curtain in the library.
Oh,
so it was just, these things just gave me such an insight into life here. But he and his brother, Prince Frederick, were very much a part of their life, and his younger sisters. So I would love to share that with you. I found it heartwarming and sad, and then, and it was just, he was an amazing man, Prince Victor. I really liked him, and I found the story of his father fascinating.
Wow,
And
it
his
was really
father's
tragic in so many ways because he was so young. He was 11 when he signed this Treaty of Lahore, and his kingdom was taken from him, and the Kohinoor and all the treasures. And then he's brought up by a Scottish family, and they were really nice to him. They were very good. But it was this alienation. He didn't know where he belonged. He became very English.
He did. And then later on, he wanted to find his Indian roots again, so he went back.
Yeah.
And then he probably converted away from Christianity.
Exactly.
But Queen Victoria gave him the anchor, because he spent a lot of time at Windsor Castle. And that's where he'd be staying when his son, Prince Victor, was at school with the Lord Carnarvon.
Right.
And what was so nice to me was, again, Lord Carnarvon just really liked him. Slightly different, rather fun. And they went on a lot of escapades all around the world. And he also took him sailing. Prince Victor didn't really have much money, and he was always in trouble. But Lord Carnarvon always franked him, so that didn't really matter. And they were there when they were together in Berlin when Prince Victor's father died in Paris. So there's all these lovely stories.
So many links, yeah. And their friendship is a lovely story, isn't it?
Friendship is always a good story. Can I ask you, so did Arthur Conan Doyle remain in touch throughout his whole life, or reverting to the mystery of the Parsi lawyer?
He did. He was, when he got married, one of the guests, so this was his second marriage, he'd fallen in love with this woman much younger than him called Jill Lecky, and he marries her. And one of the guests at the wedding is none other than George Adalji. And he must have been, he was a very awkward, shy, introvert sort of person, and he must have felt like he was, surrounded by the top authors, the publishers, the star cast. It was a very exclusive wedding reception. And there's George Adalji probably standing in a corner watching everybody. But Arthur Conan Doyle writes that he was the guest he was proudest of. So again, that's so sweet.
Wow.
He writes that in his memoir.
That is amazing. Because you put across the awkwardness so well in the book. It's absolutely fascinating, as well as the rural remoteness of the living to which they were sent. And I wonder sometimes the wisdom of that, because there might have been better livings. And I sometimes think with the church today, it's finding the right living for the right vicar, which is still very much a point of contention.
Yeah.
It's like having somebody who wishes to teach history being forced to teach Latin.
Of course.
And it doesn't sort of quite work. And I found that a really hard decision. So I paused, like a car that was having struggled changing gear at different points in the story, because some of what unfolded was unnecessary.
Yeah, but I sometimes wondered if he'd been a vicar in London, would this have happened? Probably not. But it was a recipe for disaster. Here's a man with a very pronounced Indian accent, preaching a brown man with a white wife, 3 what they'd call the sort of half-caste, in those days, half-caste children. And he's preaching the word of God to an all-white parish.
I know.
It was a recipe for disaster. So when actual tragedy happens and there's a crime, who do you catch? Who do you suspect? It's this odd family living in the vicarage. It's got to be them.
I thought they showed such resilience and acceptance of a difficult life. And funny enough, I know that's part of perhaps the teachings of Christianity, but I sometimes quite like the teachings of ancient Egypt, with its colour, with its love, with its embrace and its warmth and its positivity, which I sometimes think, well, actually, maybe I'll go Amun and Mutwe, because they embraced people and kind of looked up, rather than sort of the stoical attitude, which again I sort of very much felt through your book.
Yeah, and Parsis, there was so much ignorance as well. So Parsis, they worship the fire, and they're fire worshippers, and they worship nature. So there were all these rumors floating around that that is the reason. He goes out in the darkness to go sacrifice animals. It's part of the custom. I mean, he was a Christian, sort of baptized in this church by his father. His father is the vicar. And they had these stories. And in a way, people like Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, they wrote these stories which made Indians exotic. So, he had his role to play in it. Like, books like Sign of Four. It's the exotic, it's always the treasure, the bandits, the treasures, the Maharajas. So there's always this sense of mutiny. You're either a Maharaja with a secret, or you've got some treasures that are cursed, maybe, etc. So there is this myth around them, and I think it all builds up when there is this horrendous crime in the village.
So can I ask you, what was the starting point? What was the sentence that you read, which then turned your mind into writing the book?
It was actually a little article in the Times, and the article said that there was going to be an auction, and the auction was to be of letters to Arthur Conan Doyle, to and from Arthur Conan Doyle, from the police chief who handled the Idalji case. And for me, I said, wow, I need to find out what's in these boxes. And this was in 2015, and I said, got to find out, because Arthur Conan Doyle had written about it, but this would be the backstory. This would be what happened, what the police were thinking. They're there. They were. Yes, I actually prayed. It was Portsmouth Library. Thank goodness. I said, please let it not go to a private collector somewhere in the, some American somewhere, and I'll never see them again. But no, it was bought by the library, and they have the Arthur Conan Doyle collections. So it's open for everyone to see, and I made an appointment as soon as they'd classified it, and I was in there looking at the boxes. So, amazing stuff. Amazing. And revelations that shocked me, which even Arthur Conan Doyle wouldn't have known, which is that the police were laying traps when he started his investigation, the chief of police, he's actually laying false trails so that Conan Doyle trips up. Couldn't believe it. And he's so proud of it. He puts it in the files. And so, it was all very much line of duty in many ways, police corruption, everything. He even admits forging one of the letters to George Hidalgo, saying, I did it to trap him. So all these revelations, it just made such a fantastic story.
But those are some really important points. Who judges the judges, as usual, isn't it? Who judges those in power?
Absolutely.
Which never changes. We're still there with so many ways today. So, plus ça change again. So you've published this book. Do you begin to think about your next one or not yet?
Well, I published in the pandemic, which wasn't fun.
Yes, same for me.
And then, I just needed a break with everything going on. So it took a while, but I was thinking, So I've just started researching. I was in India in April, and I've just begun some research into the next. So let's see where it takes me. It usually takes a while to get things clear in my head, and then, but it'll be another sort of unknown story.
No, I'm absolutely sure it will. And I've so enjoyed your book, so I look forward to the next one. I think I did enjoy the historical book about the 1.5 million men in World War I. But I loved Victoria Abdul, and I've loved what I found about Queen Victoria. So I hope you'll enjoy that book as well. And I do recommend actually all of Shrabani's books to you. So go on bookshops or Amazon, but just enjoy them. And we all need to read over the summer.
Oh, yes. And I look forward to reading yours, Fiona, because that is a topic that really excites me, as it does half the world.
Well, I think you'll enjoy the bit about Prince Victor Dupsing, because I really enjoyed that, and I did a bit of the backstory there as well.
Excellent.
About his father.
I look forward to that.
To try to give him his setting, because he went on so many holidays with this family, and they were all embraced and welcomed. That made me feel happy, which is good.
That's lovely.
Shrabani, thank you so much for sitting with me here today, and may you unearth many, many more extraordinary stories.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I hope more films are made.
Well, some have been optioned, so let's keep our fingers crossed.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Shrabani. Just to remind you, please do subscribe to this podcast. Then you can have it every time it comes out.